Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the big reasons this bill should be rejected is the language in the bill in Article 9 that addresses local phone service. This part of the bill eliminates consumer protections that have been in place for decades, as well as assurances that your phone service will be reliable, and raises significant public safety concerns. According to this bill, if a company uses a technology called VoIP, which is a voice over internet protocol, the company will be able to terminate service with no notice, have no requirements to quickly restore service in the event of a failure, have no obligation to serve customers in rural or high-cost and tribal areas. There'd be no notice requirement for rate increases, and you could be locked into long-term contracts with penalty for changing companies. And there'd be no recourse if you found inaccurate billing or unauthorized charges, otherwise known as cramming. And this is no idle issue. AT&T, for example, was recently hit with a $105 million settlement for just that, for adding unauthorized charges to bills by the Federal Trade Commission. And just this past year, Washington State filed a $100 million consumer lawsuit against Comcast, alleging multiple violations of the Washington Consumer Protection Act. These are just a few of the consumer protections that would be lost, the ones that I mentioned. And cable companies like Comcast providing voice service use this technology of IP. And keep in mind, all phone networks are rapidly transitioning to IP because of its efficiency. In fact, the language of this bill is so broad that it could be interpreted that as of today, incumbent telephone companies like CenturyLink fit that definition. That's why some language that was added on in committee, if you look at the bill, subdivision 5 in section 3, called preservation of existing landline telephone service, has essentially no effect. Telephone companies are rapidly transitioning to IP networks and could, as I said, already be interpreted as IP enabled because their networks have IP components. Even now, CenturyLink uses IP networks for their business customers. Members, this bill is a significant change because with it you're regulating based on a technology rather than the service provided. Minnesota has been and should remain technology neutral in its oversight of consumer protections. So let me state this again just to be clear. VoIP or VoIP Internet Protocol is a technology. And phone companies are trying to make the case that if you use this technology, the company should not have to honor the consumer protections and assurance of reliable telephone service that have been a vital part of our telephone industry oversight for over a century. And keep in mind that consumers, they don't know if they have IP or the old analog legacy telephone service. A phone call is a phone call. Voice service is voice service. When you pick up the phone and answer it, you don't know which type of technology is in play. I also think it's worth noting and pointing out the concerns and implications for public safety. Under the current regulatory framework, a telecom company that comes to provide service in Minnesota must request a certificate of authority from the PUC, from the Public Utilities Commission. This request is then reviewed by the Department of Commerce and the Department of Public Safety, basically to see if they're a legitimate company and can do the services that they claim to offer and provide 911 services. Now the question is that we have to think about is, since there's no longer any vetting of a company's legitimacy via certification of authority, how can you be confident of the company's ability to competently provide the emergency service communications, such as 911? Now keep in mind there's over 350 telecom companies in the state of Minnesota that have these certificates of authority, and that's a dynamic number. Companies are moving in and moving out and merging, and currently we have a handle on that. Let me just mention a case of Vonage here in the state of Minnesota. Vonage is an unregulated telecom company because they use the public internet. Comcast and CenturyLink, even though they use IP Internet Protocol, they are not on the public internet. They're on a managed network system. So Vonage, again, which is unregulated because they use the public internet, sent its 911 calls to the administrative office of a local sheriff's department in the evening when no one was there. So in a point of an emergency, when a 911 call was needed, instead of going where it needed to go, this is a company that had not been vetted. It went to a sheriff's office, to an administrative office, to a telephone where no one was there. Members, with this bill, telecom companies coming to Minnesota will not be vetted by the Department of Commerce or the Department of Public Safety. And even though the bill requires, you look at it, the company to file a 911 plan, there is no longer any enforcement of that plan. The PUC has no authority to make sure that they're following the 911 laws, or if they don't follow them, to have any enforcement ability. This language in this bill harms Minnesota consumers because it completely removes the consumer protections that have been in place for over 100 years. And the bill, as I said, raises significant public safety concerns. And keep in mind, this issue is presently being litigated in Minnesota federal court right here in St. Paul, and will most certainly be appealed to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals when it's through with that. The issue they're litigating is whether the state has the authority to regulate voice service. That's IP, Internet Protocol. And this regulatory question may be answered by the new FCC and the new Congress even before the court renders a decision. That's something else to keep in mind. And lastly, after several years of work, Representative Krisha and I moved forward with some major telecom reform just this past year, providing more market flexibility for telephone companies, but preserving the consumer protections that are so necessary to the citizens of Minnesota. The legislation that we see before us would demolish that consensus agreement that provided the kind of consumer protection and market flexibility that our phone service and phone industry requires. Members, this is the kind of language we should reject. We should maintain our consumer protections. We should make sure that we have public safety that we can count on. I hope that you vote no on this bill. This language in and of itself is enough reason to do so.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Wagenius.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. This bill sabotages our new Minnesota solar.
Couple of questions. Sorry, Representative Johnson S.
Thank you, Representative Krisha. Yes, he will.
So, Representative Johnson, you and I did work on a bill last year, and was very happy and proud of that work. Although I will have to say that I don't believe the Department of Commerce or the PUC did a very good job of implementing that. One of the problems was we had asked that there be 180 days period from the start of that application to the end, and the Department of Commerce decided no, we're actually going to say 180 days from the end of that application. So there are hiccups, and I believe the Department of Commerce and the PUC has their other ideas about this. But my question on this is, what specifically, if this were to pass, Representative Johnson, would go away for VoIP providers? What regulations would go away?
Representative Johnson S.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, frankly, all the consumer protections that are in place are eliminated by the language that you're presenting, Representative Krisha.
Representative Krisha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Johnson, I have to ask specifically what in the bill. I'm looking at the bill here. I have the Article 9, and I don't see in here anywhere where we are eliminating one single regulation for VoIP providers.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, it's kind of a tricky question because the bill doesn't eliminate the consumer protections that are in statute. It just says that the PUC and the Department of Commerce are prohibited from regulating them, from enforcing those particular consumer protections. So while those protections on the book, they're in effect useless because nobody can enforce them.
Representative Krisha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And so, Representative Johnson, so for example, if I use Facebook to call my son, what regulations should be in place?
Representative Johnson.
The state regulates wireline, voice wireline. Voice wireline, that's what we're talking about. And that's the consumer protections that we want to remain in place. Voice service wireline, and there's over 30 of them. You can look them up in the statutes, and all of those will be eliminated because the PUC and the Department of Commerce would no longer be able to enforce them. That's a huge deal, and that's particularly a big deal for people who live in the rural area.
Representative Krisha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And so, Subdivision 5 says, preservation of existing landline telephone service. Nothing in this section restricts, creates, expands, or otherwise affects or modifies the obligation of a telephone company under this chapter to offer landline telephone service that is wired. So nothing in this bill touches that. In fact, we call out and say the landline provisions have to stay. Members, what this bill does is very simply ask the question, are VoIP services public utilities? Because that's what the PUC is a public utility commission. Is Facebook a public utility? Is Skype a public utility? Should they be treated as a public utility? No. If I use Skype if I use Skype in Little Falls and I call my son in Australia when he was traveling there with the Air Force, the argument that the PUC and the DOC is making is, well, that should be regulated. However, okay, so I call my son on a wired connection, or a wireless connection. I go to McDonald's, I hook up to the network, I call my son over Facebook because he didn't have the international plan, but we had Facebook, we talked to each other. That is VoIP. I called him from Little Falls, Minnesota, and I talked to him in Australia. The PUC and the DOC says we should be able to regulate that. Okay? How about I take that same phone and I go connect to a McDonald's in Omaha, Nebraska, where my family is, and I connect to a wireless network. I do the exact same thing, but I'm now not going through any of the switching technology through Minnesota. Should that be regulated by Minnesota PUC and DOC? Because now I'm in another place. So the problem with this is VoIP is not a public utility. VoIP is not bound by the same standards as a wired line that goes into my home. Absolutely. If I'm on an analog phone system, copper twisted pair, and I use that, absolutely that should be regulated. That's what we're saying. That's a public utility. Okay? So if I send, Representative Johnson, if I send a Snapchat of a cat and my daughter, should that be regulated by the PUC in Minnesota?
Representative Krisha, are you asking for Representative Johnson?
Yes, I'm sorry. Will Representative Johnson yield?
Representative Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, we're getting into the weeds here a little bit, but let me just make clear there are two types of VoIP. There's fixed, and that's the one that's regulated. Those are the ones that are in managed phone systems that Comcast and now CenturyLink uses with their business community. So that does not go over the public internet. The other type of VoIP is such as Skype or Vonage or Magic Jack. That actually goes over the public internet, so it's not as secure. The reason they call it nomadic is because if I called my daughter when she was in Australia, or she called me, I wouldn't know where she was calling from because she's calling from anywhere in Australia using whatever internet connection she has. The state has no regulatory authority over that. The only thing they have authority over is wireline voice service in the state of Minnesota. So to answer to your question, you're kind of taking us off the rails here a little bit, Representative Crecia, because we don't regulate nomadic VoIP. We don't regulate Skype. We don't regulate Vonage. We don't regulate Magic Jack. The only thing we regulate is wireline voice service in Minnesota.
Representative Crecia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So Representative Johnson, if you'll yield for another, so should Vonage be regulated?
Representative Johnson has.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, it's not a question whether they should or shouldn't. The FCC ruled that the state has no authority over it, again, because there's no way of knowing where that call is coming from, so it'd be impossible to know how to regulate that particular service. So it's a question that doesn't make any sense because the FCC regulates that particular service.
Representative Crecia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And exactly, this is how this all got started, members. Vonage challenged the fact that the PUC wanted to regulate them, and Vonage made the argument that got this whole thing rolling that said, we are not a public utility. So you're absolutely right. If Vonage should not be regulated because they're a wireless service, then this absolutely applies, members. Because what my bill simply says, what this language simply says is, if you are a voice over IP services, you are not a twisted pair analog service and therefore should not be held to the regulations of that. Why? Because we don't need to regulate them. If you don't like your cell phone service, you go get a different one. Or if you want to use a free service such as Facebook or Skype, you can't cram Skype. How cramming is the illegal activity where I add charges to a bill. You don't pay for Facebook. You don't pay for Skype. So they can't change that up on you. The other thing is there's this term called slamming, where it's illegal to, if you had AT&T analog service and they were just to switch that out on you without telling you, that should be illegal. Well, if you're using Facebook, is Facebook going to just switch you suddenly to Skype? No, that's not going to happen. Members, that's the problem with this. You're right. Representative Johnson, you say 100-year-old technology. Did we have 911 services 100 years ago? Did Dr. Graham Bell call 911 back then? He did not. Why would we put those regulations in place for the technology that's coming today? So members, what this bill simply does is it freezes what we're doing today and lets the FCC continue to set the standards. It does not allow for the PUC and the DOC to start creating regulations. If that's what you better vote against this. But if you're okay using your Facebook or your Skype and it's working for you now, then why would we give them the ability to regulate that more? That makes no sense, members. As Representative Johnson pointed out, it is nomadic. The beautiful thing about VoIP technology and wireless is it works where you are. It works great where you are. And more importantly, if you don't like it, get rid of it. Go to a different service. That's the ultimate service level. If you don't like something, go buy something else. That consumer service level is the absolute best service level you can have. So with that, thank you, Chair Garofalo, for adding this article in. I very much appreciate it. And I hope the governor can sit down with us and see the light on this, because it's going to bring better and better technology if we don't regulate it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman from Rice.
Madam Speaker?
Representative Johnson from Ramsey. Gentleman from Ramsey.
Oh, thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to address what Representative Crecia said there. Again, the state of Minnesota has no regulatory authority over internet phone service that goes over the public internet. That's Skype and Vonage. That's what he talked about. And the case that was litigated, or is currently in litigation here in St. Paul in the Minnesota Federal Court of Appeals, was Charter. It wasn't Vonage. It was Charter, the cable communications company. They, of course, the cable companies operate under VoIP. That's the technology they use to move voice services. Charter argued because they used Internet Protocol, which is a series of technical rules to use voice service, because they're using that, that the PUC had no authority over them to tell them to pay into TAP or TAM fees. That's where this whole issue began. It had nothing to do with Skype or Vonage or these public internet phone services. We have no control over that. We have no control over the public internet in the state of Minnesota. We have no control over wireless cell phones in the state of Minnesota. So just to correct that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hanson. Gentleman from St. Louis, Representative Mensah.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I just wanted to bring up a few things. I know it's been a long.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I was up quicker than I expected here. I saw your name and there was the list there. There was about 10 names. But I just wanted to quickly add to what Representative Krisha was saying there. Just one point, I guess, that brought up. So I used to teach voice and data communications in college. Taught college for 7 years. That was one of the courses I taught. And we had this exact same discussion, it must have been 2 years ago. The same language was in the bill and we had the same discussion. And it doesn't make any sense. The arguments that are being made, the very definition, or the acronym, Voice over Internet Protocol. To have a conversation and try to articulate that VoIP is not occurring over the internet, it doesn't make any sense. It's self-contradictory. One of the quickest ways to bring technology innovation and development to a screeching halt is to introduce government regulation and oversight. That will bring it to a screeching halt. The lack of government involvement in this area is what has allowed for the development of Skype, Facebook, and other communication protocols. And so, members, Krisha was spot on, Representative Krisha was spot on, and I encourage members to support the bill and not fall victim to these arguments that, again, are self-contradictory. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman from Ramsey, Representative Lesh.
Thank you,